On February the 23rd, 1868, in Lahukou, China, a Belgian missionary named Théophile Verbiest died. In August of 1865, together with 4 companions, he had begun his missionary experience in China. But let's step back. How did this adventure begin? It all began here, in the suburbs of Brussels, when Théophile Verbiest, a young diocesan priest, had the idea of starting a missionary experience that would be the Belgian mission in China, of China, for China, as he wrote. He had been nurturing this missionary vocation for some time, especially after having become director of the Holy Childhood Association in Belgium. This association concerned itself with helping abandoned children in many parts of the world, including China. Verbiest discovered that this was the framework in which he wanted to live his religious vocation to the fullest. This dream was known to some young priests in the Belgian capital, who were also attracted by the idea of committing themselves to being missionaries in the Far East. They included Alois van Zegveld, Frans Vranckx, and Remy Verlinden. The opportunity seemed to present itself in 1860, following the Franco-Chinese Treaty that opened up the borders of this immense Asian country to Christian religious works. However, Cardinal Sterckx, the Archbishop of Mechelen, heartily disapproved of the initiative, so Verbiest and van Zegveld turned to Monsignor Gonella, Nuncio of the Holy See in Belgium, asking him to plead their case with Cardinal Barnabo, prefect of the Congregation for the Propagation of Faith in Rome. Finally, things began to move. But among the conditions imposed by Verbiest's church superiors, there was a new one. A Belgian missionary project in China would be possible only if an actual institute were founded, with a headquarters, its own rules, and training for the future missionaries. In fact, the groundwork was being laid for the establishment of a new religious congregation. Verbiest and his friends were at first quite startled, but they were quickly relieved to find that other priests were showing interest in the project. This convinced them to press on. First, they had to find a residence and a training center for the institute. As often happens, the invisible hand of Providence intervened. In 1862, this statue of Our Lady of Grace was in a small chapel that stood here, a place of deep popular devotion to the Virgin Mary since medieval times. The chapel belonged to a Mr. Jean-Charles Brabant. He willingly ceded it to the nascent congregation. Shortly thereafter, a certain Miss Marie-Françoise Mas donated a house adjacent to the chapel. And so, in just a few months, the congregation's first structure came to life. The chapel and house stood in a suburb of Brussels called Skert, and the congregation became known as the Missionaries of Skert. The congregation is dedicated to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and the Institute's spirituality is essentially focused on Mary. Mary is the first and clearest example of giving one's life to spread Christ's name. Her complete faith in the Word of God makes her the missionary ideal. As Father Verbiest often wrote, she is the one true moving force behind their work.
The general purpose of the congregation is the conversion of the infidels, and the specific purpose is the preaching of the faith to the Chinese and the salvation of the many abandoned infants.
At the same time, the Articles of Association were written and were approved in November 1862 by Cardinal Sterckx. The Congregation of the Immaculate Heart of Mary was founded, with Verbiest as its first superior. Within 2 years, the first 4 members became 12. Meanwhile, the work of training continued in preparation for the first expedition to China. Today, at the Mother House in Skurt, we can find a superb Chinese museum. Right from the start, the young Skirtists preparing to leave received an introduction to Chinese language and culture, an essential requirement if they were to succeed in understanding a civilization so different from the West's.
The idea of the founder was to send objects of Chinese culture here to Europe, to help those preparing to go as missionaries to China to have some knowledge of the culture, the language, the religions, the ways of doing things, the thoughts of the Chinese people, etc. Thus, the museum was established gradually from the beginning in 1862.
And finally, in August 1865, the first group set off. It comprised 4 priests and 1 lay brother, Theophile Verbiest, Alois van Zegveld, Frans Vranckx, Ferdinand Amer, and Paul Splingard. Destination: Inner Mongolia. They were to replace the Lazarist priests in the immense territory north of Beijing. Staying behind in Skurt were 2 important members of the team that had established the congregation. Jack Bax, director of the novitiate, assisted in his organizational and ceremonial duties by Remy Verlinden. After 2 months of travel by sea, Verbiest's group entered Beijing on November the 25th, 1865. 4 days later, the missionaries left the capital, going beyond the Great Wall to the north, and after crossing mountain passes, they caught sight of the village of Chavansay. They had arrived. The first Skirtist mission could set down roots. A year later, a second group joined them. Their evangelization work could blossom, helped along by some Chinese collaborators. In 1866, they expanded the territory they were working in. Amer was assigned to the Eshui district and van Zegveld to Ximio Ergo. Along with Verbiest, Vranckx remained at Chivansa to serve as director of the local seminary. In the years that followed, the congregation spread to other districts. Initially, the missionaries directed their attention to the local Christians, but with the arrival of new forces, they could begin to concentrate on evangelizing the non-believers and taking care of the orphans there. Eventually, some 400 children were housed in 5 buildings. These were very difficult years, marked by drought, shortages, lack of resources, a hostile climate, language difficulties, and diseases that took many lives, including that of Alois van Zegveld. Ultimately, even the founder succumbed, taken by typhoid fever while on a pastoral visit. His body was interned inside the little church at Laugu. In 1930, his mortal remains were moved to Belgium, where today they lie in the chapel of the Mother House in Skurt. Verbiest was a man of deep faith, generous and open. He was able to mold the first missionaries by his example. He shared their problems and their joys, loved and was loved for his boundless apostolic zeal, and contributed to make of the congregation a cor unum et anima una, which means one heart and one soul. He received the light of God's Spirit, readily making himself available like Mary. Still today, the charisma he received burns and glows in all those who have embraced his missionary ideal. Soon, far more serious problems associated with the political situation in China were added to the missionaries' initial difficulties there. After the 2 Opium Wars that had marked the century, in the late 1800s, another anti-Western movement, the Boxers, set off a series of violent revolts against colonial advances into the Chinese Empire, and even the missionaries of Skurt would fall victim to the violence and shed their blood. 7 members were put to death by indescribable torture, including Ferdinand Ammer, perhaps the man who best embodied the missionary spirit of Skurt. Verbiest describes him in some of his letters.
The good Ammer is a true missionary. He is a true Chinese, the only one among us who fully adopted the customs and the food. His Christians are fond of him and love him like a father.
Ammer remains central to the congregation's story, not only because he is its shining martyr, but most of all because he represents its spirit and charisma in the clearest way, through his ability to adapt the message of the gospel to a radically different society and culture. Today, this trait is part of the congregation's deepest identity, an international organization that makes integration and enculturation the keys to opening hearts all over the world to the Word of Christ. After Verbiest's death, the congregation experienced a period of anxiety and disorientation. The organization's structure was still fragile and uncertain, and still too few candidates had the vocation to endure the burden of missionary commitment. Fortunately, Verbiest's first 2 successors, Franz Franks and Jerome von Artzela, were able to steer the congregation with a steady hand and saw that it was strengthened and developed.
Verbiest, le fondateur, avait un conseil.
The founder had a council responsible for the direction of the congregation. The first assistant was also there at the Shivanse Seminary. He called a meeting with the other assistants, and they took some important decisions because they were compelled to do so if they wanted the congregation to continue. They decided that Vranks himself, the first assistant, should return to Europe. Once in Brussels, he asked himself how to continue now. He informed Cardinal Sturks in Mechelen and the officials in Rome about the death of the founder.
Il a averti Rome aussi. Tout le monde devait savoir qu'est-ce qui s'est passé. Notre fondateur, il est mort.
Vranks was a person chosen by the Lord in order to continue the mission of the congregation. He had great organizational skills.
Il avait un don organisateur formidable. Alors, il a commencé en 1870.
In 1870, he began the construction of a seminary, and above the entrance there was a large stone with the inscription in Latin, Seminarium pro Sinis, because he said, "They need training that is characteristic of the missionaries of Skurt. Thus I have to have them here at home."
Vraiment scutiste. Il faut que je les ai ici chez moi.
Then, in 1877, he organized theology courses in Brussels.
In 1870, Vranckx laid the first stone of the seminary for China near the chapel at Skurt, and later organized the theology courses. An assembly at Ershi Shan'ao in 1887 was especially important. It elected Van Eertsele as superior general, but above all, it discussed the new constitutions which finally gave the congregation some stability.
En 1887, personne dans la congrégation.
Up to 1887, no one in the congregation had perpetual vows. This meant that there was something missing in the stability of the congregation. As long as there was no one with perpetual vows, there was no stability for the congregation. So finally, in 1887, Van Eertsele, the superior general, and Golui, the first assistant, made their perpetual vows here in Brussels.
Van Eertsele et Golui, le premier assistant, ici à Bruxelles, ont émis leurs vœux perpétuels.
Up to that time, in fact, it had not been necessary to make perpetual vows, and this fact obviously opened the congregation up to the risk of sudden departures and breakup, threatening its continuity and survival. Van Eertsele wanted to set the right example and was among the first to make perpetual vows.
Van Eertsele, die est pour ainsi dire le deuxième
Van Eertsele is like a second founder of the congregation. He was a very wise and skillful organizer.
Question d'organisation sage et habile.
But Van Eertsele's greatest undertaking was undoubtedly the expansion of the Skurt missionary presence beyond China. It was 1888. A new continent was opening up to evangelization: Africa.
Mais plus ou moins au même moment, le roi Léopold II.
Almost at the same time, King Leopold II conceived a plan for the people of what was to become later the independent state of Congo. He understood that to ensure success of his African enterprise, he would need the cooperation of a Belgian religious institute, because there were already a number of Protestant denominations present in the area. The king visited the then Superior General, Van Eertsele, 5 or 6 times, requesting the participation of CICM in the independent state of Congo. However, he was not successful because the few members of the congregation were already involved in China. Later, one of his advisors told him that instead of hounding the Superior General, he should direct his request to the Propaganda Fide in Rome, and that this is why a letter came one day from the Propaganda Fide addressed to the Superior General, and so, in obedience to the Vatican, the first missionaries set out for the Congo in 1888.
Under Van Eertsele, the congregation took over the direction of the African Seminary, which, under the sponsorship of King Leopold II and the Belgian Church, prepared young missionaries going to the Congo. The first group left for the newly created African state of Congo in August 1888. It consisted of Albert Gouloui, Ferdinand Huberland, Albert de Baker, and Emery Cambier, the youngest of all. After a hard, dangerous journey, they reached the village of Bobanji on November the 24th of that year. Other groups arrived in the years that followed, expanding the reach of the missionary effort to New Antwerp and Kasai in the heart of the Congo. As happened in China earlier, in the Congo too, fatigue, disease, and the unwholesome climate took many victims. In the first 10 years, more than 10 of the 50 missionaries sent to the Congo died. Emery Cambier's extraordinary mettle was legendary. He went alone to Mikolai in the Kasai region and founded the third mission. He stayed there alone for about a year before a few companions joined him. Dubbed the Pioneer of Kasai, at that time he was just over 20 years old, but he already had experience and skills far beyond most. He could do it all. Carpentry, joinery, masonry, even nursing if necessary. All extremely valuable talents in places and situations where everything had to be built and created out of virtually nothing. At the remote Luluaborg mission in 1893, Emery Cambier welcomed Superior General Van Eetzele as part of his long visit to the African missions. The Skirt missionaries were committed not just to evangelization, but to promoting people, especially by building schools and dispensaries. In the years that followed up until World War I, CICM laid down deep roots. The evangelization work yielded good results, with Congolese teachers and catechists collaborating in the work. In 1934, Charles Mbuya was ordained as the first African priest. At that time, CICM was organized into 4 vicariates: Leopoldville, New Antwerp, Boma and Kasai. In China too, the missions prospered. In the 1920s and 1930s, there were more than 100 European and Chinese missionaries and dozens of Chinese diocesan priests collaborating in the effort. Everywhere, there were schools, churches, hospitals. The sick were treated. The poor were assisted, children were educated. However, in both China and Congo, more than 200 young missionaries in their 20s and 30s died because of wars, sickness, and the harshness of the conditions. To become a missionary meant to risk an early death. Yet, despite this risk and this enormous loss of life, candidates willing to give their lives for the spreading of the gospel continued to present themselves, and the congregation continued to grow. Meanwhile, other challenges had presented themselves to the young missionary congregation, which would make it even more open and international: the undertakings in the Philippines and Indonesia. In 1898, Spain ceded the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. In subsequent years, the Catholic missionary presence was weakened by the expulsion of Spanish missionaries. They were replaced by Protestant missionaries from North America. The Philippines Apostolic Delegate asked various congregations to send missionaries, since many parishes had been left unmanned. After some hesitation, the new CICM Superior General, Joseph van Hekle, agreed to the request. In November 1907, 10 missionaries led by Petrus Direx arrived in Manila. Some of these were sent to the mountainous regions of Bontoc, others to Baguio City, in the area north of Manila, and others to Nueva Vizcaya. A hospital and a university were built at Baguio City, and a church and school at Bontoc. In short, after tireless effort, there came to be more than a dozen missions in various areas around the country. In 1937, it was Indonesia's turn. The Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith decided to assign the southern part of the island of Celebes, today known as Sulawesi, to the CICM missionaries. The territory included the city of Makassar, the region of Toraja, and the island of Muna. The first missionaries were led by Gerard Martens, and they worked hard to build and start up schools and dispensaries, in addition to their necessary commitment to evangelization. Then a firestorm hit the young mission in 1942. when the archipelago was occupied by Japanese troops, the Imperial Army quickly conquered Sulawesi. All of the CICM missionaries were interned in labor camps in inhuman conditions. Only 2 Indonesian priests were left to carry on the mission work, surprisingly assisted by some Japanese Catholic priests attached to the invading troops. But the greatest drama was yet to come. The advent of communism in China was to prove fatal for the CICM presence in that great Asian nation.
C'était des manifestations d'une hostilité des Chinois vis-à-vis.
They were expressions of the hostility of the Chinese towards the foreigners. The Catholics, the missionaries, were among the most powerful symbol of the foreign presence they resented. So some were incarcerated. Some suffered brainwashing and were forced to make public confessions. Others were killed, and there were others still who were expelled. At the beginning of this persecution, it was Father Joseph van der Poot, who was Superior General of the congregation for about 17 years, after a meeting in 1947 with the 5 provincial superiors in China, decided that the young members in formation in Belgium, who were still destined to go to China, should be sent to other missions, and that the ill and elderly confrères who were in China should return to Belgium.
Devaient rentrer en Belgique.
As often happens, a negative event led to a great opportunity. As a popular saying goes, one door closes and another opens. The congregation's expansion drew new strength from the end of the Chinese experience. Paradoxically, Skirt's original charisma was reinforced. The missionaries working in China spread all over the world, ready to encounter new societies and to reaffirm the universal nature of Christianity beyond every culture and anthropological barrier. The Skirt missionaries immediately expanded their work to other Asian countries, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Japan. On January the 12th, 1944, in the midst of World War II, Ernest Dieltens landed on Miami's airport. After an adventurous trip from Tientsin, China, he arrived in the United States to request help for the CICM missionaries interned by the Japanese. But this is just the start of a story that, in a few years, would see the rise of the first mission in the Americas. A property was purchased in Arlington, Virginia, and its name changed from Lionhurst to Missionhurst, thus giving the Skirtists in the United States the new name of Missionhurst Missionaries. The missionaries went first to Pennsylvania and Ohio, then to the south, to Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma. This was the start of their work with the Mexican communities in Texas and with the American Indians in Oklahoma. Special attention was paid to community organization and to helping marginalized people obtain their social and civic rights. It was during this period that the congregation became truly and visibly international. It was not just the European missionaries expelled from China who came to the new continent, but also the new Congolese members of the congregation. Later, Filipino and Indonesian members would come as well. Haiti is peopled by the descendants of African slaves. In 1804, they proclaimed their independence from France and created the first black republic in history. The brutal colonial oppression, uncontrolled deforestation, population density, scarce resources, and a succession of corrupt and oppressive regimes made and continue to make Haiti, one of the world's poorest countries. It was here, in 1953, that CICM's work began, helping a population that needed everything. Dispensaries and schools were opened, literacy projects and social promotion were developed, aimed especially at the young and peasants living in remote mountain areas. Special projects included the Catechetical Training Center at Papai and the recreational program for youth called Kiro. In 1987, after the Duvalier dictatorship was overthrown, a period of intimidation and violence ensued. Along with others, the congregation suffered attacks and intimidation, but the missionaries remained at their post, sharing the anxieties, fears, and abuses of their people. Between the 1950s and the 1970s, CICM missions were started in other strife-torn countries in Latin America, in Guatemala, the Dominican Republic, Brazil, and Mexico. Everywhere, the missionaries do outstanding work on behalf of the poor, human rights and social justice, following the guidelines and the winds of renewal brought about by the Second Vatican Council. 3 CICM martyrs, Father Conrado de la Cruz, Father Walter Voordeckers, and Brother Serge Bertin, all killed in Guatemala, are the most genuine evidence of this. We should also remember Father Joseph Chang Shui, born in China and raised in a CICM mission. Although he could have left for Europe when the communists took power, he decided instead to remain in China out of love for his people and to bear witness to the gospel of Christ. Arrested by the communist regime, he spent 7 years in prison and another 12 years in a labor camp. He was finally freed in 1979. For more than 35 years, he was forbidden to serve as a priest or to have contact with his CICM brothers, who had lost all track of him until they found him again in the late 1980s. He died in 1991 after a long illness. It was written of him, Father Chang was a great Chinese missionary, a man of great faith, hope and courage, who loved his country and the Chinese Catholic Church, for which he offered his life. On January the 25th, 1959, when Pope John the 23rd announced the convocation of an ecumenical council, the depth of the changes that were to affect the Church and the entire Christian community was not yet clear. There were 2 essential trends in the Council's reforms: the return to origins, to the heart of Christ's message, which implies the choice of a Church that would no longer drink from the fountains of temporal power, and the need for a productive dialogue with the modern world and with other religions. One of the decisions of Vatican II was the request that all congregations modify their constitutions as a sign of conciliatory renewal. CICM also began this work in earnest with a General Assembly held in 1967. Final approval of the new constitutions came in 1987. In the 1960s and 1970s, this renewal led to the opening of new missions in Cameroon, Zambia, Senegal, and later Mongolia. In the Congo, Philippines, and Indonesia, where CICM had put down solid roots, evangelization and social promotion efforts were expanded. In the Congo, a school of religious studies was opened in Kinshasa, the novitiate was started in Mbuidi, and the number of vocations increased. By 1989, there were 146 Congolese priests and brothers.
Aujourd'hui, le nombre des confrères a beaucoup diminué.
Today, the number of confrères has decreased significantly. Regarding the contribution of our congregation to the Church of Congo, we can say that we not only established missions, we not only started schools, but we also educated many Christians. Not just the masses of Christians, but we also educated an intellectual elite who today are among the current leaders in Congo. Today, the number of missionaries has diminished, but as they say, if the quantity is not there, the quality still is.
Si la quantité n'est pas là, la qualité est toujours là.
In the Philippines, a seminary in Baguio City opened, whilst the main diocesan seminary in Manila was entrusted to CICM. The Philippines also became an important reservoir for vocations, and in fact, it went from being a missionary receiving to a missionary sending church. During this same period, and in the following years, CICM's international transformation was completed. The Belgian-Dutch epicenter of the congregation had shifted. CICM began to experience its own universality. The training of the new candidates was taking place in the Congo, the Philippines, Cameroon, Haiti, and elsewhere. Missionaries were coming from and going to every corner of the world, foreshadowing that ideal of human brotherhood and sisterhood that we find in every passage of the Gospel.
À l'entrée, il y a toute une galerie, ce qu'on appelle la galerie des photos.
At the entrance to the museum at Skirt, Brussels, there is a gallery of nearly 3,500 photos of everyone who was ever a part of the congregation, from the founder to the present day.
Donc le fondateur, en 1862, à partir de ce moment-là, jusqu'à nous.
Since 1862, when Father Théophile Verbiest founded the Congregation of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, more than 3,000 priests and brothers have accepted the challenge and the adventure of leaving their home to bring the good news to peoples everywhere.